The Winston Train Tunnel Disaster by Ayn Rand, from Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, Part 4, Chapter 7. Kip Chalmers swore as the train lurched and spilled his cocktail all over the tabletop. He slumped forward, his elbow in the puddle, and said, "Goddamn these railroads, what's the matter with their track? You'd think with all the money they've got they'd disgorge a little so we wouldn't have to bump like farmers on a hay cart." His three companions did not take the trouble to answer. It was late, and they remained in the lounge merely because an effort was needed to retire to their compartments. The lights of the lounge looked like feeble portholes in a fog of cigarette smoke dank with the odor of alcohol. It was a private car, which Chalmers had demanded and obtained for his journey. It was attached to the end of the Comet, and it swung like the tail of a nervous animal as the Comet coiled through the curves of the mountains. "I'm going to campaign for the nationalization of the railroads," said Kip Chalmers, glaring defiantly at a small gray man who looked at him without interest. "That's going to be my platform plank. I've got to have a platform plank. I don't like Jem Taggart. He looks like a soft-boiled clam. To hell with the railroads. It's time we took them over." "Go to bed," said the man, "if you expect to look anything human at the big rally tomorrow." "Do you think we'll make it?" "You've got to make it." "I know I've got to, but I don't think we'll get there on time. This goddamn snail of a super special is hours late." "You've got to get there, Kip," said the man ominously, in that stubborn monotone of non-thinking which asserts an end without concern for the means. "Goddamn you, don't you suppose I know it?" Kip Chalmers had curly blonde hair and a shapeless mouth. He came from a semi-wealthy, semi-distinguished family, but he sneered at wealth and distinction in a manner which implied that only a top-rank aristocrat could permit himself such a degree of cynical indifference. He had graduated from a college which specialized in breeding that kind of aristocracy. The college had taught him that the purpose of ideas is to fool those who are stupid enough to think. He had made his way in Washington with the grace of a cat burglar, climbing from bureau to bureau as from ledge to ledge of a crumbling structure. He was ranked as semi-powerful, but his manner made laymen mistake him for nothing less than Wesley Mouch. For reasons of his own particular strategy, Kip Chalmers had decided to enter popular politics and to run for election as the legislator from California, though he knew nothing about that state except the movie industry and the beach clubs. His campaign manager had done the preliminary work, and Chalmers was now on his way to face his future constituents for the first time at an over-publicized rally in San Francisco tomorrow. The manager had wanted him to start a day earlier, but Chalmers had stayed in Washington to attend a cocktail party and had taken the last train possible. He had shown no concern about the rally until this evening, when he noticed that the Comet was running 6 hours late. His three companions did not mind his mood. They liked his liquor. Lester Tuck, his campaign manager, was a small, aging man with a face that looked as if he had once been punched and had never rebounded. He was an attorney who, some generations earlier, would have represented shoplifters and people who stage accidents on the premises of rich corporations. Now he found that he could do better by representing men like Kip Chalmers. Laura Bradford was Chalmers' current mistress. He liked her because his predecessor had been Wesley Mouch. She was a movie actress who had forced her way from competent featured player into incompetent star, not by means of sleeping with studio executives, but by taking the long-distance shortcut of sleeping with bureaucrats. She talked economics instead of glamour for press interviews in the belligerently righteous style of a third-rate tabloid. Her economics consisted of the assertion that we've got to help the poor. Gilbert Keith Worthing was Chalmers' guest for no reason that either one of them could discover. He was a British novelist of world fame who had been popular 30 years ago. Since then, nobody bothered to read what he wrote, but everybody accepted him as a walking classic. He had been considered profound in uttering such things as, Freedom? Do let's stop talking about freedom. Freedom is impossible. Man can never be free of hunger, of cold, of disease, of physical accidents. He can never be free of the tyranny of nature. So why should he object to the tyranny of a political dictatorship? When all of Europe put into practice the ideas which he preached, he came to live in America. Through the years, his style of writing and his body had grown flabby. At 70, he was an obese old man with retouched hair and a manner of scornful cynicism, retouched by quotations from the yogis about the futility of all human endeavor. Kip Chalmers had invited him because it seemed to look distinguished. Gilbert Keith Worthing had come along because he had no particular place to go. "God damn these railroad people," said Kip Chalmers. "They're doing it on purpose. They want to ruin my campaign. I can't miss that rally. For Christ's sake, Lester, do something." "I've tried," said Lester Tuck. At the train's last stop, he had tried by long-distance telephone to find air transportation to complete their journey. But there were no commercial flights scheduled for the next 2 days. "If they don't get me there on time, I'll have their scalps and their railroad. Can't we tell that damn conductor to hurry?" "I've told him 3 times. "I'll get him fired. He's given me nothing but a lot of alibis about all their messy technical troubles. I expect transportation, not alibis. They can't treat me like one of their day coach passengers. I expect them to get me where I want it, when I want it. Don't they know that I'm on this train?" "They know it by now," said Laura Bradford. "Shut up, Kip, you bore me." Chalmers refilled his glass. The car was rocking and the glassware tinkled faintly in the shelves on the bar. The patches of starlit sky in the windows kept swaying jerkily, and it seemed as if the stars were tinkling against one another. They could see nothing beyond the glass bay of the observation window at the end of the car, except a small halo of green and red lanterns marking the rear end of the train, and a brief stretch of rail running away from them into the darkness. A wall of rock was racing the train, and the stars dipped occasionally into a sudden break that outlined, high above them, the peaks of the mountains of Colorado. "Mountains," said Gilbert Keith Worthing with satisfaction. "It is a spectacle of this kind that makes me feel the insignificance of man. What is this presumptuous little bit of rail which crude materialists are so proud of building compared to that eternal grandeur? No more than the basting thread of a seamstress on the hem of the garment of nature. If a single one of those granite giants chose to crumble, it would annihilate the strain." "Why should it choose to crumble?" asked Laura Bradford without any particular interest. "I think this damn train is going slower," said Kip Chalmers. "Those bastards are slowing down, in spite of what I told them." "Well, it's the mountains, you know," said Lester Tuck. "Mountains be damned, Lester. What day is it? With all those damn changes of time, I can't tell which—" "It's May the 27th, said Lester Tuck. "It is May the 28th, said Gilbert Keith Worthing, glancing at his watch. "It is now 12 minutes past midnight." "Jesus!" cried Chalmers. "And the rally is today?" "Yep," said Lester Tuck. "We won't make it, The train gave a sharper lurch, knocking the glass out of his hand. The thin sound of its crash against the floor mixed with the screech of the wheel flanks tearing against the rail of a sharp curve. "I say," asked Gilbert Keith Worthing nervously, "are your railroads safe?" "Hell yes," said Kip Chalmers. "You've got so many rules, regulations, and controls that those bastards wouldn't dare not to be safe. Lester, how far are we now? What's the next stop?" "There won't be any next stop until Salt Lake City." "I mean, what's the next station?" Lester Tuck produced a soiled map, which he had been consulting every few minutes since nightfall. "Winston," he said. "Winston, Colorado. Kip Chalmers reached for another glass. Tinky Holloway said that Wesley said that if you don't win this election, you're through, said Laura Bradford. She sat sprawled in her chair, looking past Chalmers, studying her own face in a mirror on the wall in the lounge. She was bored, and it amused her to needle his impotent anger. Oh, he did he? Wesley doesn't want what's his name, whoever's running against you, to get into the legislature. If you don't win, Wesley will be sore as hell, Tinky said. Damn that bastard. He'd better watch his own neck. Oh, I don't know. Wesley likes him very much. She added, Tinky Holloway wouldn't allow some miserable train to make him miss an important meeting. They wouldn't dare to hold him up. Kip Chalmers sat staring at his glass. I'm going to have the government seize all the railroads, he said, his voice low. Really? Said Gilbert Keith Worthing. I don't see why you haven't done it long ago. This is the only country on earth backward enough to permit private ownership of railroads. Well, we're catching up with you, said Kip Chalmers. Your country is so incredible naive. It's such an anachronism. All the talk about liberty and human rights, I haven't heard it since the days of my great-grandfather. It's nothing but verbal luxury of the rich. After all, it doesn't make any difference to the poor whether their livelihood is at the mercy of an industrialist or of a bureaucrat. The day of the industrialists is over. This is the day of... The jolt felt as if the air within the car smashed them forward while the floor stopped under their feet. Kip Chalmers was flung down to the carpet. Gilbert Keith Worthing was thrown across the tabletop. The lights were blasted out. Glasses crashed off the shelves. The steel of the walls screamed as if about to rip open, while a long, distant thud went like a convulsion through the wheels of the train. When he raised his head, Chalmers saw that the car stood intact and still. He heard the moans of his companions and the first shriek of Laura Bradford's hysterics. He crawled along the floor to the doorway, wrenched it open, and tumbled down the steps. Far ahead on the side of a curve, he saw moving flashlights and their red glow at a spot where the engine had no place to be. He stumbled through the darkness, bumping into half-clothed figures that waved the futile little flares of matches. Somewhere along the line, he saw a man with a flashlight and seized his arm. It was the conductor. What happened? Gasped Chalmers. Split rail, the conductor answered impassively. The engine went off the track. Off? On its side. Anybody killed? No. The engineer's all right. The fireman is hurt. Split rail? What do you mean, split rail? The conductor's face had an odd look. It was grim, accusing, and closed. Rail wears out, Mr. Chalmers, he answered with a strange kind of emphasis. Particularly in curves. Didn't you know that it was worn out? We knew. Well, why haven't you it replaced? It was going to be replaced, but Mr. Locky cancelled that. Who's Mr. Locky? The man who is not our operating vice president. Chalmers wondered why the conductor seemed to look at him as if something about this catastrophe was his fault. Well, aren't you going to put the engine back on the track? That engine's never going to be put on any track from the looks of it. But it's got to move us. It can't. Beyond the few moving flares and the dulled sounds of screams, Chalmers sensed suddenly, not wanting to look at it, the black immensity of the mountains, the silence of hundreds of uninhabited miles, and the precarious strip of a ledge hanging between a wall of rock and an abyss. He gripped the conductor's arm tighter. But what are we going to do? The engineer's gone to call Winston. Call? How? There is a phone a couple of miles down the track. Will they get us out of here? They will. But... Then his mind made a connection with the past and the future, and his voice rose to a scream for the first time. How long will it have to wait? I don't know, said the conductor. He threw Chalmers's hand off his arm and walked away. The night operator of Winston Station listened to the phone message, dropped the receiver and raced up the stairs to shake the station agent out of bed. The station agent was a husky, surly drifter who had been assigned to the job 10 days ago by order of the new district superintendent. He stumbled dazedly to his feet, but he was knocked awake when the operator's words reached his brain. "What?" he gasped. "Jesus, the Comet! Well, don't stand there shaking, call Silver Springs." The night dispatcher of the division headquarters at Silver Springs listened to the message, then telephoned Dave Mitchum, the new superintendent of the Colorado division. "The Comet!" gasped Mitchum, his hand pressing to the phone receiver to his ear and feet hitting the floor and throwing him upright out of bed. "The engine done for! The diesel!" "Yes, sir." Oh God Almighty! What are we going to do?" Then, remembering his position, he added, "Well, send out the racking train." "I have." "Call the operator at Sherwood to hold all traffic." "I have." "What have you got on the sheet?" "The Army Freight Special westbound, but it's not due for about 4 hours. It's running late." I'll be right down. Wait, listen, get Bill, Sandy, and Clarence down by the time I get there. There's going a lot of hell to pay." Dave Mitchum had always complained about injustice because he said he had always had bad luck. He explained it by speaking darkly about conspiracy of the big fellows who would never give him a chance, though he did not explain just whom he meant by the big fellows. Seniority of service was his favorite topic of complaint and sole standard of value. He had been in the railroad business longer than any man who had advanced beyond him. This, he said, was proof of the social system's injustice, though he never explained just what he meant by the social system. He had worked for many railroads, but had not stayed long with any one of them. His employers had no specific misdeeds to charge against him, but had simply eased him out, because he said, "Nobody told me to," too often. He did not know what he owed his present job to a deal between James Taggart and Wesley Mouch. When Taggart traded to Mouch the secret of his sister's private life, in exchange for a raise in rates, Mouch made him throw in an extra favor by their customary rules of bargaining, which consisted of squeezing all he could out of any given trade. The extra was a job for Dave Mitchum, who was the brother-in-law of Claude Slagenhop, who was the president of the Friends of Global Progress, who were regarded by Mouch as a valuable influence on public opinion. James Taggart pushed the responsibility of finding a job for Mitchum onto Clifton Locky. Locky pushed Mitchum to the first job that came up, superintendent of the Colorado division, when the man holding it quit without notice. The man quit when the extra diesel engine at Winston Station was given to Chick Morrison's special. "What are we going to do?" cried Dave Mitchum, rushing half-dressed and groggy with sleep into his office where the chief dispatcher, the train master, and the road foreman of engines were waiting for him. The three men did not answer. They were a middle-aged man with years of railroad service behind them. A month ago, they would have volunteered their advice in any emergency, but they were beginning to learn that things had changed and that it was dangerous to speak. "What in hell are we going to do?" "One thing is certain," said Bill Brent, the chief dispatcher. "We can't send a train into the tunnel with a coal-burning engine." Dave Mitchum's eyes grew sullen. He knew that this was the one thought on all their minds. He wished Brent had not named it. "Well, where do we get a diesel?" he asked angrily. "We don't," said the road foreman. "But we can't keep the Comet waiting on his side all night." "Looks like we have to," said the train master. "What's the use of talking about it, Dave? You know that there is no diesel anywhere in the division." "But Christ almighty, how do they expect us to move trains without engines?" "Miss Taggart didn't," said the road foreman. "Mr. Locky does." "Bill," asked Mitchum, in the tone of pleading for one favor, Isn't there anything transcontinental that's due tonight, with any sort of a diesel? First one to come, said Bill Brent implacably, will be number 236, the fast freight from San Francisco, which is due at Winston at 7:18 a.m., he added. That's a diesel, and the diesel closest to us at this moment. I've checked. What about the Army special? Better not think about it, Dave. That one is superiority over everything in the line, including the Comet, by order of the Army. They're running late, as it is. Journal box has caught fire twice. They're carrying munitions for the West Coast arsenals. Better pray that nothing stops them out of the division. If you don't think we'll catch hell for holding the Comet, it's nothing what we'll catch if we try to stop that special. They remained silent. The windows were open to the summer night, and they could hear the ringing of the telephone in the dispatcher's office downstairs. The signal lights winked over the deserted yards that had once been busy division point. Mitchum looked toward the roundhouse, where the black silhouettes of a new steam engine stood outlined in the dim light. A tunnel, he said and stopped. It is 8 miles long, said the trainmaster with harsh emphasis. I was only thinking, snapped Mitchum. Better not think of it, said Brent softly. I haven't said anything. What was that talk you had with Dick Horton before you quit? The road foreman asked too innocently, as if the subject were irrelevant. Wasn't it something about the ventilation system of the tunnel being on the bum? Didn't he say that tunnel was hardly safe nowadays even for a diesel engine? Why do you bring that up? Snapped Mitchum. I haven't said anything. Dick Horton, the division chief engineer, had quit 3 days after Mitchum's arrival. I thought I'd just mention it, the road foreman answered innocently. Look, Dave, said Bill Brent, knowing that Mitchum would stall for another hour rather than formulate a decision. You know that there is only one thing to do. Hold the Comet at Winston till morning, wait for number 236, have her diesel take the Comet through the tunnel, then let the Comet finish the run with the coal burner we can give it on the other side. But how late will that make her? Brent shrugged. 12 hours, 18 hours, who knows? 18 hours for the Comet? Christ, that's never happened before. None of what's been happening to us has ever happened before, said Brent, with the astonishing sound of weariness in his brisk, competent voice. But they'll blame us for it in New York. They'll put all the blame on us. Brent shrugged. A month ago he would have considered such an injustice inconceivable. Today he knew better. I guess, said Mitchum miserably, I guess there's nothing else that we can do. There isn't, Dave. Oh, God. Why did this have to happen to us? Who is John Galt? It was 2:30 when the Comet, pulled by an old switch engine, jerked to a stop on the siding of Winston Station. Kip Chalmers glanced out in incredulous anger at the few shanties on desolate mountainside and at the ancient hovel of a station. Now what? What in hell are you stopping here for? He cried and rang for the conductor. With the return of motion and safety, his terror had turned into rage. He felt almost as if he had been cheated by having been made experience an unnecessary fear. His companions were still clinging to the tables of the lounge. They felt too shaken to sleep. How long? The conductor said impassively in answer to his questions. Till morning, Mr. Chalmers. Chalmers stared at him stupefied. We're going to stand here till morning. Yes, Mr. Chalmers. Here. Yes. But I have a rally in San Francisco in the evening. The conductor did not answer. Why? Why do we have to stand? Why in hell? What happened? Slowly, patiently, with contemptuous politeness, the conductor gave him an exact account of the situation. But years ago, in grammar school, in high school, in college, Kip Chalmers had been taught that man does not and need not live by reason. Damn your tunnel, he screamed. Do you think I'm going to let you hold me up because of some miserable tunnel? Do you want to wreck vital national plans on account of a tunnel? Tell your engineer that I must be in San Francisco by evening and that he's got to get me there. How? That's your job, not mine. There is no way to do it. Then find a way, goddamn you! The conductor did not answer. Do you think I'll let your miserable technological problems interfere with a crucial social issue? Do you know who I am? Tell that engineer to start moving if he values his job. The engineer has his orders. Orders be damned. I give the orders these days. Tell him to start at once. Perhaps you'd better speak to the station agent, Mr. Chalmers. I have no authority to answer you as I'd like to, said the conductor and walked out. Chalmers leaped to his feet. Say, Kip, said Lester Tuck uneasily. Maybe it's true. Maybe they can't do it. They can if they have to, snapped Chalmers, marching resolutely to the door. Years ago in college, he had been taught that the only effective means to impel man to action was fear. In the dilapidated office of Winston Station, he confronted a sleepy man with slack, worn features and a frightened young boy who sat at the operator's desk. They listened in silent stupor to a stream of profanity such as they had never heard from any section gang. And it's not my problem. How you get the train through the tunnel, that's for you to figure out. Chalmers concluded. But if you don't get me an engine and don't start that train, you can kiss goodbye to your jobs, your work permits, and this whole goddamn railroad. The station agent had never heard of Kip Chalmers and did not know the nature of his position. But he knew that this was a day when unknown men in undefined positions held unlimited power, the power of life or death. It is not up to us, Mr. Chalmers, he said pleadingly. We don't issue the orders out here. The order came from Silver Springs. Suppose you telephone Mr. Mitchum and... Who's Mr. Mitchum? He's the division superintendent at Silver Springs. Suppose you send him a message to... I should bother with a division superintendent. I'll send a message to Jim Taggart. That's what I'm going to do. Before the station agent had time to recover, Chalmers whirled to the boy, ordering, You, take this down and send it at once. It was a message which, a month ago, a station agent would not have accepted from any passenger. The rules forbade it. He was not certain about any rules any longer. Mr. James Taggart, New York City. Am held up on the Comet at Winston, Colorado, by the incompetence of your man who refused to give me an engine. Have meeting in San Francisco in the evening of top-level national importance. If you don't move my train at once, I'll let you guess the consequences. Kip Chalmers. After the boy had transmitted the words into the wires that stretched from pole to pole across the continent as guardians of the Taggart track, after Kip Chalmers had returned to his car to wait for an answer, the station agent telephoned Dave Mitchum, who was his friend, and read him the text of the message. He heard Mitchum groan in answer. I thought I'd tell you, Dave. I never have heard of that guy before, but maybe he's somebody important. I don't know, moaned Mitchum. Kip Chalmers? You see his name in the newspapers all the time, right? And all with the top-level boys. I don't know what he is, but if he's from Washington, we can take any chances. Oh, Christ, what are we going to do? We can't take any chances. Though the Taggart operator in New York transmitted the message by telephone to James Taggart's home. It was close to 6 a.m. in New York, and James Taggart was awakened out of the fitful sleep of a restless night. He listened to the telephone, his face sagging. He felt the same fear as the station agent of Winston, and for the same reason. He called the home of Clifton Locky. All the rage which he could not pour upon Kip Chalmers was poured over the telephone wire upon Clifton Locky. Do something, screamed Taggart. I don't care what you do, it's your job, not mine. But see to it that the train gets through. What in hell is going on? I've never heard of the Comet being held up. Is that now how you run your department? It's a fine thing when important passengers have to start sending messages to me. At least when my sister ran the place, it wasn't awakened in the middle of the night over every spike that broke in Iowa, Colorado, I mean. I'm so sorry, Jim, said Clifton Locky smoothly, in a tone that balanced apology, reassurance, and the right degree of patronizing confidence. It's just a misunderstanding. It's somebody's stupid mistake. Don't worry. I'll take care of it. I was, as a matter of fact, in bed, but I'll attend to it at once. Clifton Locky was not in bed. He had just returned from a round of nightclubs in the company of a young lady. He asked her to wait and hurried to the offices of Taggart Transcontinental. None of the night staff who saw him there could say why he chose to appear in person, but neither could they say that it had been unnecessary. He rushed in and out of several offices, was seen by many people, and gave an impression of great activity. The only physical result of it was an order that went over the wires to Dave Mitchum, superintendent of the Colorado Division. Give an engine to Mr. Chalmers at once. Send the Comet through safely and without unnecessary delay. If you are unable to perform your duties, I shall hold you responsible before the Unification Board. Clifton Locky. Then, calling his girlfriend to join him, Clifton Locky drove to a country roadhouse to make certain that no one would be able to find him in the next few hours. The dispatcher at Silver Springs was baffled by the order that he had handed Dave Mitchum, but Dave Mitchum understood. He knew that no railroad order would ever speak in such terms as giving an engine to a passenger. He knew that the thing was a showpiece. He guessed what sort of show was being staged, and he felt a cold sweat at the realization of what was being framed as the goat of the show. "What's the matter, Dave?" asked the train master. Mitchum did not answer. He seized the telephone, his hands shaking as he begged for a connection to the Taggart operator in New York. He looked like an animal in a trap. He begged the New York operator to get him Mr. Clifton Locky's home. The operator tried. There was no answer. He begged the operator to keep on trying and to try every number he could think of where Mr. Locky might be found. The operator promised, and Mitchum hung up, but he knew that it was useless to wait or to speak to anyone in Mr. Locky's department. "What's the matter, Dave?" Mitchum handed him the order and saw by the look on the trainmaster's face that the trap was as bad as he suspected. He called the region headquarters of Taggart Transcontinental at Omaha, Nebraska, and begged to speak to the general manager of the region. There was a brief silence on the wire. Then the voice of the Omaha operator told him that the general manager had resigned and vanished 3 days ago over a little trouble with Mr. Locky, the voice added. He asked to speak to the assistant general manager in charge of his particular district, but the assistant was out of town for the weekend and could not be reached. "Get me somebody else!" Mitchum screamed. "Anybody of any district, for Christ's sake, get me somebody who'll tell me what to do!" The man who came on the wire was the assistant general manager of the Iowa-Minnesota district. "What?" he interrupted at Mitchum's first words. "At Winston, Colorado. Why in hell are you calling me? No, don't tell me what happened. I don't want to know it. No, I said, no. You're not going to frame me into having to explain afterwards why I did or didn't do anything about whatever it is. It's not my problem. Speak to some region executive. Don't pick on me. What do I have to do with Colorado? Oh, hell, I don't know. Get the chief engineer. Speak to him." The chief engineer of the central region answered impatiently. "Yes, what is it?" And Mitchum rushed desperately to explain. When the chief engineer heard that there was no diesel, he snapped, "And hold the train, of course." When he heard about Mr. Chalmers, he said, his voice suddenly subdued, "Kip Chalmers of Washington? Well, I don't know. That would be a matter for Mr. Locky to decide." When Mitchum said, "Mr. Locky ordered me to arrange it, but—" The chief engineer snapped in great relief, "Then do exactly as Mr. Locky says," and hung up. Dave Mitchum replaced the telephone receiver cautiously. He did not scream any longer. Instead, he tiptoed to a chair, almost as if he were sneaking. He sat looking at Mr. Locky's order for a long time. Then, he snatched a glance about the room. The dispatcher was busy at his telephone. The trainmaster and road foreman were there, but they pretended that they were not waiting. He wished Bill Brent, the chief dispatcher, would go home. Bill Brent stood in a corner watching him. Brent was a short, thin man with broad shoulders. He was 40, but looked younger. He had the pale face of an office worker, and the hard, lean features of a cowboy. He was the best dispatcher on the system. Mitchum rose abruptly and walked upstairs to his office, clutching Locky's order in hand. Dave Mitchum was not good at understanding problems of engineering and transportation, but he understood men like Clifton Locky. He understood the kind of game the New York executives were playing and what were now doing to him. The order did not tell him to give Mr. Chalmers a coal-burning engine, just an engine. If the time came to answer questions, wouldn't Mr. Locky gasp in shocked indignation that he had expected a division superintendent to know that only a diesel engine would be meant in that order? The order stated that he was to send the Comet through safely. Wasn't a division superintendent expected to know what was safe? And without unnecessary delay. What was an unnecessary delay? If the possibility of a major disaster was involved, wouldn't a delay of a week or a month be considered necessary? The New York executives did not care, thought Mitchum. They did not care whether Mr. Chalmers reached his meeting on time or whether an unprecedented catastrophe struck their rails. They cared only about making sure that they would not be blamed for either. If he held the train, they would make him the scapegoat to appease the anger of Mr. Chalmers. If he sent the train through and it did not reach the western portal of the tunnel, they would put the blame on his incompetence. They would claim that he had acted against their orders in either case. What would he be able to prove? To whom? One could prove nothing to a tribunal that had not been stated publicly. No defined procedure, no rules of evidence, no binding principles. A tribunal suggests the unification board that pronounced man guilty or innocent as it saw fit, with no standard of guilt or innocence. Dave Mitchum knew nothing about the philosophy of law, but he knew that when a court is not bound by any rules, it is not bound by any facts, and then a hearing is not an issue of justice, but an issue of man, and your fate depends not on what you have or haven't done, but on whom you do or you do not know. He asked himself what chance he would have at such a hearing against Mr. James Taggart, Mr. Clifton Locky, Mr. Kip Chalmers, and their powerful friends. Dave Mitchum had spent his life slipping around the necessity of ever making a decision. He had done it by waiting to be told and never being certain of anything. All that he now allowed into his brain was a long, indignant whine against injustice. Fate, he thought, had singled him out for an unfair amount of bad luck. He was being framed by his superiors in the only good job he had ever held. He had never been taught to understand that the manner in which he obtained his job, as the frame-up, were inextricably parts of the single whole. As he looked at Locky's order, he thought that he could not hold the Comet, attach Mr. Chalmers' car to an engine, and send it into the tunnel alone. But he shook his head before he thought it was fully formed. He knew that this would force Mr. Chalmers to recognize the nature of the risk. Mr. Chalmers would refuse. He would continue to demand a safe and non-existent engine. And more, this would mean that he, Mitchum, would have to assume responsibility, admit full knowledge of the danger, stand in the open, and identify the exact nature of the situation. The one act which the policy of his superiors was based on evading. The one key to their game. Dave Mitchum was not a man to rebel against his background or to question the moral code of those in charge. The choice he made was not to challenge, but to follow the policy of his superiors. Bill Brent could have beaten him in any contest of technology, but here was an endeavor at which he could beat Bill Brent without effort. There had once been a society where men needed the particular talents of Bill Brent if they wished to survive. What they needed now was the talent of Dave Mitchum. Dave Mitchum sat down at his secretary's typewriter and, by means of 2 fingers, carefully typed out an order to the trainmaster and another to the road foreman. The first instructed the trainmaster to summon a locomotive crew at once, for a purpose described only as an emergency. The second instructed the road foreman to send the best engine available to Winston to stand by for emergency assistance. He put carbon copies of the orders into his own pocket, then opened the door, yelled for the night dispatcher to come up, and handed him the 2 orders for the 2 men downstairs. The night dispatcher was a conscientious young boy who trusted his superiors and knew that discipline was the first rule of railroad business. He was astonished that Mitchum should wish to send written orders down one flight of stairs, but he asked no questions. Mitchum waited nervously. After a while, he saw the figure of the road foreman walking across the yards towards the roundhouse. He felt relieved. The two men had not come up front and confront him in person. They had understood, and they would play the game as he was playing it. The road foreman walked across the yards, looking down at the crowd. He was thinking of his wife, his two children, and the house in which he had spent a lifetime to own. He knew that his superiors were doing, and he wondered whether we should refuse to obey them. He had never been afraid of losing his job. Within the confidence of a competent man, he had known that if he quarreled with one employer, he would always be able to find another. Now, he was afraid. He had no right to quit or to seek a job. If he defied an employer, he would be delivered into an unanswerable power of a single board. And if the board ruled against him, it would mean being sentenced to the slow death of starvation. It would mean being barred from any employment. He knew that the board would rule against him. He knew that the key to the dark, capricious mystery of the board's contradictory decisions was the secret power of pull. What chance would he have against Mr. Chalmers? There had been a time when the self-interest of his employers had demanded that he exercise his most of ability. Now, ability was not wanted any longer. There had been a time when he had required to do his best and rewarded accordingly. Now, he could expect nothing but punishment if he tried to follow his conscience. There had been a time when he had been expected to think. Now, they did not want him to think, only to obey. They did not want him to have any conscience any longer. Then why should he raise his voice? For whose sake? He thought of the passengers, the 300 passengers aboard the Comet. He thought of his children. He had a son in high school and a daughter 19, of whom he was fiercely, painfully proud, because she was recognized as the most beautiful girl in town. He asked himself whether he could deliver his children to the fate of the children of the unemployed, as he had seen them in the blighted areas, in the settlements around closed factories and along the tracks of discontinued railroads. He saw in astonished terror that the choice which he now had to make was between the lives of his children and the lives of the passengers of the Comet. A conflict of this kind had never been possible before. It was by protecting the safety of the passengers that he had earned the security of his children. He had served one by serving the other. There had been no clash of interests, no call for victims. Now, if he wanted to save the passengers, he had to do it at the price of his children. He remembered dimly the sermons he had heard about the beauty of self-immolation, about the virtue of sacrificing to others, that which was one's dearest. He knew nothing about the philosophy of ethics, but he knew suddenly, not in words, but in the form of a dark, angry, savage pain, that if this was virtue, then he wanted no part of it. He walked into the roundhouse and ordered a large, ancient coal-burning locomotive to be made ready to run for Winston. The trainmaster reached for the telephone in the dispatcher's office to summon an engine crew as ordered, but his hand stopped, holding the receiver. It struck him suddenly that he was summoning men to their death, and that the 20 lives listed on the sheet before him, 2 would be ended by his choice. He felt a physical sensation of cold, nothing more. He felt no concern, only a puzzled, indifferent astonishment. It had never been his job to call men out to die. His job had been to call them out to earn their living. It was strange, he thought, and it was strange that his hand had stopped. What made it stop was like something he would have felt 20 years ago. No, he thought, strange only 1 month ago, but not longer. He was 48 years old. He had no family, no friends, no ties to any living being in the world. Whatever capacity for devotion he had possessed, the capacity which others scatter among many random concerns, he had given it whole to the person of his young brother, the brother, his junior by 25 years, whom he had brought up. He had sent him through technological college, and he had known, as had all the teachers, that the boy had the mark of genius on the forehead of his grim young face. With the same single-tracked devotion as his brothers, the boy had cared for nothing but his studies, not for sports, nor parties or girls, only for the vision of the things he was going to create as an inventor. He had graduated from college and had gone, on a salary unusual for his age, into the research laboratory of a great electrical concern in Massachusetts. This was now May the 28th, thought the trainmaster. It was on May the 1st that Directive 10-289 had been issued. It was on the evening of May the 1st that he had been informed that his brother had committed suicide. The trainmaster had heard it said that the directive was necessary to save the country. He could not know whether this was true or not. He had no way of knowing what was necessary to save a country. But driven by some feeling which he could not express, he had walked into the office of the editor of the local newspaper and demanded that they publish the story of his brother's death. "People have to know it," had been all he could give as a reason. He had been unable to explain that the bruised connections of his mind were formed the wordless conclusion that if this was done by the will of the people, then the people had to know it. He could not believe that they would do it if they knew. The editor had refused. He had stated that it would be bad for the country's morale. The trainmaster knew nothing about political philosophy, but he knew that had been the moment when he lost all concern for life or death or any human being in the country. He thought, holding the telephone receiver, that maybe he should warn the men who were about to be called. They trusted him. It could never occur to them that he could knowingly send them to their death. But he shook his head. This was only an old thought, last year's thought, a remnant of the time when he had trusted them too. It did not matter now. His brain worked slowly, as if he were dragging his thought through a vacuum where no emotion responded to spur them on. He thought that there would be trouble if he warned anyone. There would be some sort of fight, and it was he who had to make some great effort to start it. He had forgotten what it was that one started this sort of fight for. Truth, justice, brother love? He did not want to make any effort. He was very tired. If he warned all of the men on his list, he thought, there would be no one to run that engine. So it would save 2 lives and also 300 lives aboard the Comet. But nothing responded to the figures in his mind. Lives was just a word. It had no meaning. He raised the telephone receiver to his ear and called 2 numbers. He summoned an engineer and a fireman to report for duty at once. Engine number 306 had left for Winston when Dave Mitchum came downstairs. "Get a track motorcar ready for me," he ordered. "I'm going to run up to Fairmount." Fairmount was a small station 20 miles east of the line. The man nodded, asking no questions. Bill Brent was not among them. Mitchum walked into Brent's office. Brent was there, sitting silently at his desk. He seemed to be waiting. "I'm going to Fairmount," said Mitchum. His voice was aggressively too casual, as if implying that no answer was necessary. "I had a diesel there a couple of weeks ago. Emergency repairs or something. I'm going down to see if we could use it." He paused, but Brent said nothing. "The way things stack up," said Mitchum, not looking at him, "we can't hold the train till morning. We've got to take a chance one or the other way. Now I think maybe this diesel will do it, but that's the last one we can try for. So, if you don't hear from me in half an hour, sign the order and send the Comet through with number 306 to pull her." Whatever Brent had thought, he could not believe it when he heard it. He did not answer at once. Then he said very quietly, "No." "What do you mean, no?" "I won't do it." "What do you mean you won't? It's an order." "I won't do it." Brent's voice had the firmness of certainty unclouded by any emotion. "Are you refusing to obey an order?" "I am." "But you have no right to refuse, and I'm not going to argue about it either. It's what I've decided, it's my responsibility, and I'm not asking for your opinion. Your job is to take orders. Will you give me that order in writing? Why, goddamn you, are you hinting that you don't trust me, are you? Why do you have to go to Fairmount, Dave? Why can't you telephone them about that diesel, if you think they've got one? You're not going to tell me how to do my job. You're not going to sit there and question me. You're going to keep your trap shut and do as you're told, or I give you a chance to talk to the Unification Board. It was hard to decipher emotions on Brent's cowboy face, but Mitchum saw something that resembled a look of incredulous horror. Only it was horror at some side of his own, not at the words, not at the quality of fear, not the kind of fear Mitchum had hoped for. Brent knew that tomorrow morning the issue would be his word against Mitchum's. Mitchum would deny having given the order. Mitchum would show written proof that engine number 306 had been sent to Winston only to stand by, and would produce witnesses that he had gone to Fairmount in search of a diesel. Mitchum would claim that the fatal order had been issued by and on the sole responsibility of Bill Brent, the chief dispatcher. It would not be much of a case. Not a case that could bear close study, but it would be enough for the Unification Board, whose policy was consistent only in not permitting anything to be studied closely. Brent knew that he could play the same game and pass the frame up to another victim. He knew that he had the brains to work it out, except that he would rather be dead than do it. It was not the sight of Mitchum that made him sit still in horror. It was the realization that there was no one whom he could call to expose this thing and to stop it. No superior anywhere on the line, from Colorado to Omaha to New York. They were all on it, all of them. They were doing the same. They had given Mitchum the lead and the method. It was Dave Mitchum who now belonged to this railroad, and he, Bill Brent, who did not. As Bill Brent had learned to see, by a single glance of a few numbers on a sheet of paper, the entire trackage of a division. So he was now able to see the whole of his life and the full price of the decision he was making. He had not fallen in love until he was past his youth. He had been 36 when he had found the woman he wanted. He had been engaged to her for the last 4 years. He had had to wait because he had a mother to support and a widowed sister with 3 children. He had never been afraid of burdens because he had known the ability to carry them. And he had never assumed an obligation unless he was certain that he could fulfill it. He had waited, he had saved his money, and now he had reached a time when he felt himself free to be happy. He was to be married in a few weeks, this coming June. He thought of it as he sat at his desk looking at Dave Mitchum, but the thought aroused no hesitation, only regret and a distant sadness. Distant because he knew that he could not let it be part of this moment. Bill Brent knew nothing about epistemology, but he knew that man must live by his own rational perception of reality, that he cannot act against it or escape it to find a substitute for it, and that there is no other way for him to live. He rose to his feet. It's true that so long I hold this job, I cannot refuse to obey you, he said. But I can, if I quit. So, I'm quitting. You're what? I'm quitting, as of this moment. But you have no right to quit, you goddamn bastard. Don't you know that? Don't you know I'll have thrown you in jail for that? If you want to send the sheriff for me in the morning, I'll be at my home. I won't try to escape. There is no place to go. Dave Mitchum was 6'2" and had the build of a bruiser, but he stood shaking with fury and terror over the lion's figure of Bill Brent. You can't quit. There's a law against it. I've got the law. You can't walk out on me. I won't let you out. I won't let you leave this building tonight. Brent walked to the door. Will you repeat that order you gave me in front of the others? No? Then I will. He pulled open the door, Mitchum's fist shot out, smashed into his face and knocked him down. The trainmaster and road foreman stood in the open doorway. He quit! Screamed Mitchum. The yellow bastard quit at a time like this. He's a lawbreaker and a coward. In the slow effort of rising from the floor, through the haze of blood running into his eyes, Bill Brent looked up at the 2 men. He saw that they understood, but he saw the closed faces of men who did not want to understand, did not want to interfere, and hated him for putting them on the spot in the name of justice. He said nothing, rose to his feet and walked out of the building. Mitchum avoided looking at the others. "Hey you," he called, jerking his head at the night dispatcher across the room. "Come here. You've got to take over at once." With the door closed, he repeated to the boy the story of the diesel at Fairmount, as he had given it to Brent, and the order to send the Comet through with engine number 306 if the boy did not hear from him in half an hour. The boy was in no condition to think, to speak, or to understand anything. He kept seeing the blood on the face of Bill Brent, who had been his idol. "Yes, sir," he answered numbly, and Dave Mitchum departed for Fairmount, announcing to every yardman, switchman, and wiper in sight as they boarded the track motorcar that he was going in search of a diesel for the Comet. The night dispatcher sat at his desk watching the clock and the telephone, praying that the telephone would ring and let him hear from Mr. Mitchum. But a half hour went by in silence, and when there were only 3 minutes left, the boy felt a terror he could not explain, except that he did not want to send that order. He turned to the trainmaster and the road foreman, asking hesitantly, "Mr. Mitchum gave me an order before he left, but I wonder whether I ought to send it, because I don't think it's right," he said. The trainmaster turned away. He felt no pity. The boy was about the same age as his brother had been. The road foreman snapped, "Do just as Mr. Mitchum told you. You're not supposed to think," and walked out of the room. The responsibility that James Tarrant and Clifton Locky had evaded now rested on the shoulders of a trembling, bewildered boy. He hesitated, then he buttressed his courage with the thought that one did not doubt the good faith and the competence of railroad executives. He did not know that his vision of a railroad and its executives was that of a century ago. With the conscientious precision of a railroad man, in the moment when the hand of the clock ended in half hour, he signed his name to the order, instructing the Comet to proceed with engine number 306, and transmitted the order to Winston station. The station agent at Winston shuddered when he looked at the order, but he was not the man to defy authority. He told himself that the tunnel was not, perhaps, as dangerous as he thought. He told himself that the best policy these days was not to think. When he handed their copies of the order to the instructor and the engineer of the Comet, the conductor glanced slowly about the room, from face to face, folded the slip of paper, put it into his pocket, and walked without a word. The engineer stood looking at the paper for a moment, then threw it down and said, "I'm not going to do it. And if it's come to where this railroad hands out orders like this one, I'm not going to work for it either. Just list me as having quit." "But you can't quit," cried the station agent. "They'll arrest you for it." "If they find me," said the engineer, and walked out of the station into the vast darkness of the mountain night. The engineer from Silver Springs, who had brought in number 306, was sitting in the corner of the room. He chuckled and said, "He's yellow." The station agent turned to him. "Will you do it, Joe? Will you take the Comet?" Joe Scott was drunk. There had been a time when a railroad man reporting for duty with a single sign of intoxication would have been regarded as a doctor arriving at work with a source of smallpox on his face. But Joe Scott was a privileged person. 3 months ago, he had been fired for an infraction of safety rules which had caused a major wreck. 2 weeks ago, he had been reinstated in his job by order of the Unification Board. He was a friend of Fred Kinnan. He protected women's interests in the union, not against employers, but against the membership. "Sure," said Joe Scott. "I'll take the Comet. I'll get her through, if I can go fast enough." The fireman of number 306 had remained in the cab of the engine. He looked up uneasily when they came to switch this engine to the head end of the Comet. He looked up at the red and green lights of the tunnel hanging in distance above 20 miles of curves. But he was a placid, amicable fellow who had good fireman with no hope of ever rising to engineer. His husky muscles were his only asset. He felt certain that his superiors knew what they were doing, so he did not venture any questions. The conductor stood by the rear end of the Comet. He looked at the lights of the tunnel, then at the long chain of the Comet's windows. A few windows were lighted, but most of them showed only feeble blue glow of night lamps ending the lowered blinds. He thought that he should rouse the passengers and warn them. That there had been a time when he had placed the safety of the passengers above his own, not by reason of love for his fellow man, but because that responsibility was part of his job, which he accepted and felt pride in fulfilling. Now he felt a contemptuous indifference and no desire to save them. They had asked for and accepted Directive 10-289 and thought they went on living daily turning away in evasion from that kind of verdicts the Unification Board was passing on defenseless victims. Why shouldn't he turn away from that? If he saved their lives, not one of them would come forward to defend him when the Unification Board would convict him of disobeying orders, for creating a panic, for delaying Mr. Chalmers. He had no desire to be a martyr for the sake of allowing people safely to indulge in their own irresponsible evil. When the moment came, he raised his lantern and signaled the engineer to start. "See?" said Kip Chalmers triumphantly to Lester Tuck as the wheels under their feet shuddered forward. "Fear is the only practical means to deal with people." The conductor stepped onto the vestibule of the last car. No one saw him as he went down the steps to the other side, slipped off the train, and vanished into the darkness of the mountains. A switchman stood ready to throw the switch that would send the Comet from the siding onto the main track. He looked at the Comet as it came slowly towards him. It was only a blazing white globe, with the beam stretching high above his head and the jerky thunder rumbling through the rail under his feet. He knew that the switch would not be thrown. He thought of the night 10 years ago, when he had risked his life in a flood to save a train from a washout. But he knew that the times had changed. In the moment when he threw the switch and he saw the headlight jerk sidewise, he knew that he would now hate his job for the rest of his life. The Comet uncoiled from the siding into a thin, straight line and went on into the mountains, with the beam of the headlight like an extended arm pointing that way, and the lighted glass curve of the observation lounge ending it off. Some of the passengers aboard the Comet were awake. As the train started its coiling ascent, they saw the small cluster of Winston's lights at the bottom of the darkness beyond their windows. Then the same darkness, but with red and green lights by the hole of a tunnel on the upper edge of the window panes. The lights of Winston kept growing smaller each time they appeared, and the black hole of the tunnel kept growing larger. A black veil went streaking past the windows at times, dimming the lights. It was the heavy smoke from the coal-burning engine. As the tunnel came closer, they saw on the edge of the sky far in the south, in a void of space and rock, a spot of living fire twisting in the wind. They did not know, and they did not care to learn. It is said that catastrophes are a matter of poor chance, and there were those who would have said that the passengers of the Comet were not guilty or responsible for the thing that happened to them. The man in bedroom A, car number 1, was a professor of sociology who taught that individual ability was of no consequence, that individual effort is futile, that an individual conscience is a useless luxury, that there is no individual mind or character or achievement, that everything is achieved collectively, and that it's masses that count, not man. The man in room 7, car number 2, was a journalist who wrote that it is proper and moral to use compulsion for a good cause, who believed that he had the right to unleash physical force upon others, to wreck lives, throttle ambitions, strangle desires, violate convictions, to imprison, to despoil, to murder, for the sake of whatever he chose to consider as his own idea of a good cause, which did not even have to be an idea, since he had never defined what he regarded as the good, but had merely stated that he went by a feeling unrestrained by any knowledge, since he consisted emotion superior to knowledge and relied solely on his own good intentions and the power of a gun. The woman in room 10, car number 3, was an elderly schoolteacher who had spent her life turning class after class of helpless children into miserable cowards by teaching them that the will of the majority is the only standard of good and evil, that the majority may do anything it pleases, that they must not assert their own personalities, but must do as the others were doing. The man in drawing room B, car number 4, was a newspaper publisher who believed that men are evil by nature and unfit for freedom, that their basic instincts, if left unchecked, are to lie, to rob, and to murder one another, and therefore must be ruled by means of lies, robbery, and murder, which must be made the exclusive privilege of the rulers, for the purpose which forcing men to work, teaching them to be moral, and keeping them within the bounds of order and justice. The man in bedroom H, car number 5, was a businessman who had acquired his business, an ore mine, with the help of a government loan under the Equalization of Opportunity Bill. The man in drawing room A, car number 6, was a financier who had made a fortune by buying frozen railroad bonds and getting his friends in Washington to defreeze them. The man in seat 5, car number 7, was a worker who believed that he had a right to a job, whether his employer wanted him or not. The woman in roomette 6, car number 8, was a lecturer who believed that as a consumer she had a right to transportation, whether the railroad people wished to provide it or not. The man in roomette 2, car number 9, was a professor of economics who advocated the abolition of private property, explaining that intelligence plays no part in industrial production, that man's mind is conditioned by material tools, that anybody can run a factory or a railroad, and it's only a matter of seizing the machinery. The woman in bedroom D, car number 10, was a mother who had put their 2 children to sleep in the berth above her, carefully tucking them in, protecting them from drafts and shoals. A mother whose husband held a government job, enforcing directives which she defended by saying, "I don't care, it's only the rich that they hurt. After all, I must think of my children." The man in roomette 3, car number 11, was a sniveling little neurotic who wrote cheap little plays into which, as a social message, he inserted cowardly little obscenities to the effect that all businessmen are scoundrels. The woman in roomette 9, car number 12, was a housewife who believed that she had the right to elect politicians, of whom she knew nothing, to control giant industries of which she had no knowledge. The man in bedroom F, car number 13, was a lawyer who said, "Me? I'll find a way to get along under any political system." The man in bedroom A, car number 14, was a professor of philosophy who taught that there is no mind. How do you know that the tunnel is dangerous? No reality. How can you prove that the tunnel exists? No logic. Why do you claim the trains cannot move without motive power? No principles. Why should you be bound by the law of cause and effect? No rights. Why should you attach man to their jobs by force? No morality. What's moral about running a railroad? No absolutes. What difference does it make to you if you live or die anyway? He taught that we know nothing. Why oppose the orders of the superiors? That we can never be certain of anything. How do you know you're right? That we must act on the expediency of the moment. You don't want to risk your job, do you? The man in drawing room B, car number 15, was an heir who had inherited his fortune and who kept repeating, "Why should Rand be the only one permitted to manufacture Rand metal?" The man in bedroom A, car number 16, was a humanitarian who said, "The men of ability, I do not care what or if they are made to suffer, they must be penalized in order to support the incompetent." Frankly, I do not care whether this is just or not. I take pride in caring to grant any justice to the able where mercy to the needy is concerned. These passengers were awake. There was not a man aboard the train who did not share one or more of their ideas. As the train went into the tunnel, the flame of Wyatt's torch was the last thing they saw on Earth.